Yes. Closing statement.
عظيم جدا. So again, thank you very much for having me today. It is my great pleasure to speak about disability and the inclusivity of public space. So yeah, I mean, disability is lived experience of myself. As Mr. Mohandas Muhammad just mentioned, that I am a blind person. So that means I am living with the barriers, living with the challenges that most of my disabled colleagues are facing, because not because of their impairments, but because that the community is not ready for them. The community is not welcoming to them. The community is not accessible and inclusive to them. So the structure of my presentation today, we will be talking a little bit about the objectives. We will be talking about definitions, because I thought that definitions of disability, we are not in a theoretical lecture, but we have lots of misinterpretations to the concept of disability and what does disability mean. So I thought it's very important to speak about that, to speak about the evolution of that term and why it's important for us to understand it as it is presented within conventions and within different rights-based legal frameworks. So moving from objectives to definitions, I decided today to bring you some interesting things to show, like some 3D maps or maybe models, also some best practices from different countries where those people have managed actually very good to mainstream disabled people rights within public space. So, I mean, to start with, and then at the end, I will, if we have some time, I'll try my best to give a little bit of recommendations as well. And what's really more interesting for me is, more than my presentations, is your interactive discussions, questions, thoughts that I think you are most welcome to write it down starting from now, anytime. أي حد عنده سؤال يحب يكتبه على الشات عن التوبيك بتاع النهارده، لو مش يقدر يفتكره لغايه اخر اللقاء يعني ده يكون لطيف جدا. That would be great to write your question whenever you have a moment. As we need to use today's discussions as an opening platform for discussions, for provoking debates around why disability, why the inclusivity of public space is important, why it's important for everyone to have an equal access to public space. So moving forward, so the objective of today really is to speak and addressing the importance of inclusive space. Why creating inclusive space is important? Why are we talking about that today? And what we can do, what mechanisms, what methods, what procedures that we can follow to make these public spaces are accessible and reasonable for everyone. I should mention that when we are talking for accessibility for disabled people, we're talking for accessibility for everyone. Like if you are a pregnant woman, an elderly person, or anyone who cannot even walk easily, it will be good for all of us for pavements to be accessible. It will be very good for all of us to have ramps and to have these ramps designed in a good format. It would be very good for the bathrooms to be disabled accessible, and so on and so forth. It would be very good for railway stations, elevators to be talking. So, and we have tons of other examples, but I need just to clarify that accessibility is not only important for disabled people, but it is really important for everyone who is part of that community. And we will see that this is why we're talking about inclusion today. So for example, like I was speaking about breaking down some assumptions about disabled people are a homogeneous group. ان احنا دايما نبص للاشخاص المعاقين ان هم فئة قليلة، فئة محرومة، فئة ما بتاخدش حقوقها بشكل كبير، ودايما بننساهم واحنا بنعمل التصميمات بتاعتنا او الخطط بتاعتنا. It's always difficult for us to remember disabled people during their design. So we have some examples here. people who are having, especially those actually who have like invisible disability. They're not blind, they're not using wheelchairs, people who are autistic, people who are having mental difficulties, we're not thinking of them at all. Do they have some structured or things that they need in the design? Yes, definitely. So they say that the barrier starts just before the trip begins, since that person going outside of his home facing lots of difficulties to move around. So definitely, for example, lots of autistic people, and actually myself as a blind person, always finding airports is not accessible. Always finding the staff that I'm dealing with is not accessible. The design of the airport, somehow the design of the aircrafts is not accessible for us, is not wide, not only for wheelchairs, but for everyone. We always sometimes limiting our thoughts that disability and accessibility means wheelchair accessibility, means ramp and a bathroom. It is definitely not. This is the simplest thought that we can. It's really important, but this is the simplest idea that we should, and then we should think of many other elements. Like for me, I need a braille materials. For me, I need a 3D maps sometimes. For me, I need sometimes a description, an audio descriptions to things around me. And these are all should be added to the idea of inclusive design. But moving forward, and I think what we need to discuss here first is definition. And if we are sitting together in a room, actually, I would have asked all of you, like, what do you think of disability? What does disability mean? What does disabled person means in front of you? Like, when you think of a disability, what's the first thing that comes into your mind? Yeah, I'm just waiting 1 minute for people to think, because it's very important for us to think, what does disability mean? We should differentiate here between disability and impairment. لازم نفرق جدا بين كلامنا عن الإعاقة وكلامنا عن الخلل اللي عند الشخص. I have an impairment because I'm blind, but I have a disability or not, it's an important question. Because I will have a disability only if the building is not accessible for me. I will have a disability only if the menu is not in Braille. I will have a disability only if I cannot access the educational materials and research documents and readings, because then I will have a disability. And I will not have a disability just if everything is introduced well for me. So if we chosen, for example, a blind person living in Senegal or Uganda or whatever, when any country, and choosing another a blind person within the same level of impairments living in Stockholm or living in one of the Scandinavian countries. For sure, that person who lives in a Scandinavian country's disability is less. And why it's less? Because everything is accessible. I wouldn't want, I'm holding my phone now and I'm reading to you all the presentation from my phone. And I wouldn't be able to read that presentation without my software screen is reading to me, as you can see, as you can listen now. So that screen reader read to me things, and then I don't have a disability. But if I don't have that software, I will have a disability, right? So in all cases, I have an impairment. Someone who is deaf or hearing impaired will have an impairment, but a disability or not, depending on the level of the barriers available in front of that person within him/or her community. فاحنا بنتكلم على فكرة العوائق، وإنه إزالة العوائق من قدام الشخص اللي عنده إعاقة هي دي اللي بتخلي ما عندوش إعاقة. مش المشكلة أبدا إن هو عنده كف بصر أو عنده مشكلة في السمع أو عنده مشكلة في الحركة، لكن المشكلة هو متقدم له إيه وسائل وأدوات وديزاين of public space that accessible and available to his use. وفي الحالة دي الشخص ده مش هيكون عنده disability. وطبعا مهم جدا, it's really important here to refer to that disability is an important science. محتاجين نفهم كويس ونفكر كويس مع بعض ان هو علم كبير جدا. هنا مثلا at the United Kingdom where I'm staying right now عندنا disciplines كبيرة جدا تحت كلمة disability. فعندنا we have lots of people who are just working in an inclusive education. ازاي نقدر ندمج الناس في المدارس، ازاي نقدر ندمجهم في الجامعات، وايه هي reasonable accommodation, what is the reasonable accommodation and accessible measures that we need to consider within these things. And it's science. انا عندي البي اتش دي بتاعتي في مجال له علاقه بالديسابيلتي، وناس تانية بتدرس مجالات كتيره مختلفه different fields all related to disability. So you need to think that disability is a science. عشان دايما لما بنلاقي الناس تطلع في التلفزيون وتتكلم من غير علم ومن غير إدراك وهم مش أشخاص عندهم إعاقة وبيتكلموا عن الأشخاص اللي عندهم إعاقة, it is an issue that we definitely need to diminish, and we give more space and an opportunity for disabled people to speak on their behalf. فاحنا عندنا convention اسمها Convention of Rights of Persons with Disability أو الاتفاقية الدولية لحقوق الأشخاص المعاقين. ودي اتفاقية صدقت عليها مصر وكل الدول العربية وكل دول العالم، حوالي 119 دولة as far as I remember 119 countries who ratified the convention, and which bring this convention into real legality like as an important global disability discourse. عندنا كمان ال SDGs. لو اتكلمنا على goal number 11 of the SDGs. لو Mr. Muhammad, Engineer Muhammad, if you help me moving forward to the SDGs slide. احنا عندنا SDG number 11 talking about the inclusivity of public space, when a very important in احنا remove environmental barriers. So now we have an inclusivity comes as a framework that cross-cutting each everything. And عندنا sustainable development strategies, which is 2030 visions that each of the country decided to take as a response to these SDGs, decided into we need to remove physical and environmental barriers, which means in our context of discussion today is an accessible public space. We should think first when we discuss disability, we should think of inclusion. And inclusion is a wider concept, is a very big concept. It's not only talking about disability. Inclusion is an important and wider approach that consider women, disabled people, Christians, children, aging population, gender, and so on and so forth. And always people talking about inclusion in these things, but somehow I find that people forgetting a discussion about rights of disabled people. We are 10 to 15% from at least from each country, according to the WHO. If we consider the families of people who are like us, also disabled, we're talking about more and more people and families who are affected or injured or maybe negatively impacted only because communities not giving them their rights and definitely not giving them the chance to play their duties. But so we discussed disability and inclusion. We talked about the convention and SDGs as an important framework, and that yeah, and definitely when we talk about removing the barriers, that as well brings to the attention the very important theme, which is participation. It is not fair for you to design a public space without asking a disabled person on his needs. What do you like to have for your public space in order for you to design it according to their demands? It is not fair for you to only think of your theories and literature and science, which is great, without having a primary or maybe a secondary source, I don't mind, anything that you can, just to ensure that the voice of that person who will use the place is with you during your design. So I need actually to show you an interesting design here. So in here in Leeds, they're doing some experimental maquettes or things for us as a disabled people to watch. So like this building, which is a tall building, and this is the bridge, and so on and so forth. So this is kind of a 3D model from a material that people can touch, and they send it to different disabled people and ask them, what do you think? What do you would like the streets to look like? Do you need that rail which is in the bridge or not? How you would like things to be in a way tactile? Is that clear for you? And so on, right? Is that clear? مهندس محمد حضرتك سامعني؟
Yes.
عظيم جدا. As a continuation to this, definitely we need to think of removing the barriers. We need to think of modifying procedures, modifying areas to be accessible for everyone. We need to consult with disabled people, as I said, this is why we will feel the true meaning of inclusion. We in the United Nations Convention, I should mention the universal design, and the universal design is really important, and I'm sure that all of you are aware of it. And the universal design is a design where acknowledging all needs and all and different populations and different citizens as well. And we should apply, if we applied universal design everywhere, we wouldn't need to discuss that today. We wouldn't need to discuss that you need to give that pavement the space in the wheelchair. We wouldn't need the traffic lights to be accessible and beeping so people can cross. People who lives in Europe know that we are talking about zebra crossing, which a blind person can touch with his leg. Then you can know that this is a traffic light. And actually, as Mohammed mentioned, like I have a YouTube channel where lots of videos talking about accessibility. You are definitely, I ask you, Mr. Mohammed, if you can add it to that chat as well, so people can watch the videos and learn more about the accessibility.
I'll add it to the chat. Yeah.
So I would like to move now to the best practices. And I hope that this would be the most interesting part of the presentation. I thought to bring three important best practices from different countries to show you how people think of that. So the first best practice that I'm talking about is from Mexico. Yeah, so definitely we need to make sure this project need to make sure that the area near train station is accessible and the seating areas are wide enough for people to move around, and the grounds have these lines that blind people can with their stick use and move around. The tactile maps is available, 3D models and stuff, and they are proud of such project that they made. And I'm sure if you just written online inclusive and accessible cities or public space and accessibility, you will find tons of interesting resources. And we should mention here that each country now, or the majority of countries, having an accessible code, accessible building codes. And here in the UK, and I think in Egypt, since I'm Egyptian, and many other countries, you can find a code that people can use. The problem is that when you have a permission to build something, people who are giving you permission not considering the reasonable accommodation as part of their criteria during the revision of these permissions. So لما بندي ترخيص او بندي موافقه على مبنى ما بناخدش في اعتبارنا، المهندسين ما بياخدوش في بعضهم ما بياخدوش في اعتبارهم التصميمات الخاصه اللي تضمن للاشخاص ذوي الاعاقه ان هم يقدروا يدخلوا المباني، من اول كوبس النور، من اول المدخل بتاع المبنى الواسع، من اول باب الحمامات الضيق اللي دايما ما بناخدش بالنا واحنا بنعمله، لغايه ديفينتلي التاكتايلز ولغايه التوكينجز واللايتس وطريقه اللايتنجز بتضايق ناس كتيره جدا. Lots of people having problems with lighting. People have epilepsy, people who are autistic, people who are having different types of impairment, facing difficulties many times just because of the lights are different, or the colors of walls and ceiling are different. So we need to learn these things and consider it in our mind. And as I said, it is a science. There are many guidelines available that are talking about that. The project that we are talking about in Mexico definitely consider the universal design. They consider the universal design of the Convention of Rights of People with Disability. The project also considered the participatory approach, listen to disabled people. Local community were involved. We need everyone to give support. People, when they give support to something, they feel that they have a public space. They did some graffitis and some images. So the whole community understands the importance of the accessibility of public space. So if we move to the achievements, definitely when we make lots of, they made lots of publicization or publicity to their work, awareness raising to their communities, and definitely disabled people managed to go outside. It's funny, أحب إن أنا يعني to give that example that we always say why disabled people in Europe is more than disabled people in our country. It is not the case. The case that disabled people in our countries, in Egypt, or maybe some of the lower and middle income countries, sitting at home just because of inaccessibility, just because they cannot move around, just because the public space is not accessible for them. In fact, poor countries have more disabled people, according to statistics, more than the minority world. But you cannot see them. You don't see lots of disabled people, basically because of the infrastructure and the means of accessibility is not there. So this is why we need to always think while we're designing things, and this is why I'm looking forward to your questions, how we can make these things accessible. Definitely, we need to that project managed to encourage the investors, business companies, the public, the private companies to invest more money for the accessibility. Accessibility is not always expensive, by the way. It's a misunderstanding. Accessibility somehow could be done with low-cost solution, but it would be cheaper and cheaper if we consider it before building before the institution or whatever, rather than doing it afterwards, because it costs a lot and somehow not being professionally made. Spending money, definitely in accessibility, they find that spending money in accessibility could be financially beneficial, not only for disabled people, because it adds to the accessibility of everyone. And urban designers and engineers learned a lot about local products, because we don't need to buy products from the European countries. We can use lots of local products and turn it into accessibility. I remember lots of places in villages and districts in Egypt and many places where they used very low cost solutions to make things accessible for them. I will yeah. Right. So if I move to the next one, and this one, it's really interesting to me. The next best practices that I'm talking about here is about making the historical cities accessible. And if you looked online about accessible tourism, there are a yearly conferences happening in Canada and everywhere of how we make touristy destinations are accessible for disabled people. It is very good because it add a lot to the community. So imagine that if we have 10% or 15% of each country is disabled, and those people had the chance to travel and enjoy touristic places and museums like other. That will add a lot to the country's economy. Definitely, I'm speaking here while my eye into Egypt. I've got lots and lots of museums, but unfortunately, we have some good initiatives, but the majority not yet being accessible, which shouldn't be the case in the framework of the new disability law, shouldn't be the case within the convention, that we have a convention of rights of people with disability as well. So the European Foundation led a project that focused on making cities in Italy, Denmark, France, and Bulgaria is more accessible. The objective that to make sure that disabled people can fully enjoy and access that. And actually, I need to tell you lots of personal experiences when I'm going to a museum. I can wear a headphone to hear audio description. I can touch 3D models to know things, how it's look like, and you have Braille names written on it. I can also enjoy a touch tour where we can touch places, and these are organized. I should mention the positive like initiative of the Egyptian Museum here. They are trying to do lots of good practices, but we still miles to go to ensure that accessibility, like it's out of the context. I managed to attend the ballet, like Swan Lake Ballet, بحيرة البقع, only because, while I'm totally blind, only because it is accessible. So you have a touch tool, people can telling you the stories, you can read the braille inside the theater, and so on and so forth. So it's not only about constructions, right? It's not only about ramps and bathrooms. It's more and more things that we need to consider. And that project, the best practice that I'm talking about, managed to turn lots of cultural activities in these countries that I've mentioned in the European Union accessible. And what's interesting is that they made a replicable model. So they made a model, عملوا نموذج أو تصميم أو ديزاين يقدروا المتاحف الأخرى والناس الباقية تاخدوا في اعتبارها without touching negatively the historic architecture as well. Definitely we have accessible routes, accessible parks, accessible malls, accessible museum, and so on and so forth. I'm sorry I'm using the word accessible a lot today, but we need to make sure that we understand the importance of accessibility of public space and to see some of the best practices. The third model that I'm talking about here, let me first, before moving forward, again, this project that I was talking about consider the idea of participation. So the Elizabeth, the project coordinator, was mentioning that we thought like we will never be able to structure a project about accessibility without asking disabled people to be participants, to be as the other participants. What do you need? What do you like for you in order to be, for the museums to be accessible? What we can do to ensure that these things. So for example, I went to Louvre museum, and one interesting thing that they made a very accessible good, but they written the braille in French. They written in French braille, not in English. So as someone who cannot know, who doesn't read French or doesn't speak French, it was inaccessible for me, right? And this is one example of, if you like to make things accessible for international visitors, you need to write things in different languages and in different ways. I'm moving to the third example and my last example, and I do apologize if I'm talking so long, but I'm moving to Marburg, which is a famous city in Germany, and it is famous for its full accessibility for blind people. مدينة اسمها ماربورغ، وهي مشهورة بأنها مدينة أكثر من أشهر مدن العالم إتاحة للأشخاص اللي عندهم إعاقة بصرية. I think the reason behind that is that there is an academy structured in this city at 1916, and this academy was designed, was impacted the whole city to be accessible, and definitely all shops, malls, bank machines, grounds, tactile maps, 3D models, railway station accessible. And it is a journey. So you do the constructions accessible, then we will do the materials to be accessible, then we will train the staff who are working in public services how they can provide accessible service for everyone. And the goal is for all of us to have an equal access to things. The goal is for all of us to have an inclusive access to things. So and you need to do that with an approach of customization. It's a magic word in an accessibility, like you need to customize. Not all of us can receive, I am blind, but I can use computer. Another person who is blind cannot use the computer. Someone can read braille. Other person can listen to audio, and so on and so forth. So we need to think of customization as well. مهندس محمد، انا اتكلمت قد ايه لغايه دلوقتي وقت عشان ما اخدش
لا
الوقت؟
حضرتك خد راحتك خالص، مفيش مشكلة دلوقتي. لا احنا معانا وقت لسه حضرتك، احنا دلوقتي فات حوالي ساعة الا ربع
right.
او
Um,
اقل كمان.
يعني أنا أحب إن إحنا نخلص يعني to finish to open the floor, but we need also to think of the accessibility of transportation. It is really important, talking buses, screens in buses for people who are having a hearing impairment, and ramps for the bus as well. As I said, you do one design and the other service complete your design with another accessible service. It is a comprehensive process that ensure that constructions, public services, places, restaurants, coffee shops, elevators, buildings are accessible for everyone when we need to consider the wider concept of accessibility.
Historical city incorporating accessibility into tourism and culture sector. Like bullet, significant cause of this is that the city is home to Germany's only academy. 8F. Recommendations.
So my recommendations here, one or two recommendations, and we can definitely discuss more and more, is the first one is we need to think that diverse groups of people with disability should be included during the decision making process. They should be consulted. We need to always consider not only physical disability, we need also to consider people who have an intellectual and mental impairments. We need to consider people who have an hearing impairments. And yes, each of them has different tools, different designs that required. It is not hard. It just needed to be studied in order for us to ensure a diversified and inclusive public space. We need definitely, and this is very, very important actually, we need to make lots of efforts. And this is, I'm talking to AMAKEN here and to any other networks. We need to do lots of efforts to train engineers and to raise awareness, your awareness on what requirements, what standards available, what legal frameworks are available to be considered to ensure of accessibility, because I wouldn't imagine that we will wake up tomorrow morning and all engineers knowing that of their hearts. We need to let them know about it. And it is not a simple topic. It's a must now for us to do so. And we need to do that in an intersectional approach. So you don't need to bring engineers only to sit together. Hey, let's talk about disability. It's not only the case. It's the case that we need to talk all together with everyone to ensure that that disability, we're not looking at disability as a personal tragedy or as an individual problem, rather than a social model, removing barriers, rights-based approach. It is your right to, as a disabled, to access things equally and inclusively. And we need to give them lots of examples, best practices, models, and so on and so forth. And there are lots of conferences happening worldwide with UN Habitat, with UNDISA and UNDP. Lots of conferences happening about the accessible and inclusive design now. It's taken lots of attention, and like I'm seeing lots of country developing projects now, and it's good for us to think of how these projects could be accessible. I will stop here. I mean, I don't want to be so boring to all of you, talking a lot about disability and accessibility, inclusion and participation. But I hope that you can get something from this presentation. That is nothing about us without us, nothing about anyone actually. I will not be able to talk about women without the voice of women. I will be killed. So I mean, it's important to do not talk about disabled people without the voice of disabled people. I give some examples of urban designs and cities and public spaces and how that should be accessible, with some examples of 3D models that by chance I have them today. So I thought, like, why not showing them to you? And again, thank you to without thank you to Engineer Muhammad, Lobna, and Dr. Amir, who definitely provided me with a chance to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mostafa, for this interesting presentation. And we shared with you the YouTube channel for Dr. Mostafa in the chat box. So please feel free to visit this very interesting channel. And feel free to read these further readings that you see on the screen. This is extra readings about this very interesting and important topic. Of course, this was very interesting presentation. I will use my power as a moderator to start the discussion about the right to the city for everybody, not only for disabled people. I mean, if we're talking about accessibility, about participation in decision making, this is the right that many countries has very big problem in applying this participatory approach, even with the normal citizens, not only the disabled. So we are talking about, I mean, very high level concept here.
Engineer Mohammed, maybe your microphone is doing, I think, look,
I'll
جنب جدا.
طيب اوكي هحاول اغير السماعه. كده احسن؟
Yeah.
كده احسن. طيب. Okay. So I was talking about this very important concept of participation in decision making. This is not only the responsibility of the urban planners, but also the responsibility of the decision makers. They should apply these very important concepts about accessibility and rights in public spaces for everybody. You should apply the concept of humanizing cities, how to make the people, the city more human and more accessible to the citizens. So we have questions here. So I see that some participants are raising hands. Iman, can you please ask your question?
أيوة. Thank you, Dr. Mohammed. Thank you, Dr. Mostafa جدا for this presentation. عايزة أقول لحضرتك دكتور مصطفى إن هو قال إن إحنا لازم دايما نخلي حد disabled هو اللي يشارك في أي قرار بناخده، فهو كلامه عنده حق وصح فيه. بس بقول له برضو إن لو حد ما عندوش disability أو أي impairment فهو برضو بيبقى interest في التوبك دوت، ويهمه جدا إن يكون ما فيش أي disability أو barriers لأي إنسان في الدنيا بيتحرك أو accessible، يبقى accessible لكل spaces. وإن أنا my thesis في الماجستير والدكتوراه هما الاثنين أنا شغالة على accessibility for mentally challenged people كلهم اللي هم ذوي الإعاقة العقلية، وطبعا بيبقى included فيهم سواء كان blind أو أي بقى impairment تانية بتخش فيه، لأن هو ممكن يكون فيه أكتر من إعاقة في الشخص يعني. وهو كلامه صح إن هو مش الكونستراكشنز بس أو السبيسز، فهو في حاجات كتير بتخش related للفكرة دي، إن تخلي أي space accessible سواء كان public spaces أو private spaces حتى سواء كانت في البيوت أو كده. وكل الماتيريالز هم مستخدمة سواء كانت الساينس دايركتورز المابس 3D مابس زي ما هو بيقول البرايل، كل الحاجات دي والكالرز والتكتشر، كل الحاجات دي مهمة جدا. وإن أنا بحاول أدرسها للطلبة بتاعتي، أعلمهم يعني إيه universal design، يعني إيه inclusive design، علشان إحنا نبدأ من البداية إنهم يتعلموا إنه يحطوا الأسس ديت جوه التصميم بتاعهم، أو الجايد لاينز دي تبقى جزء من التصميم بتاعهم. فإحنا لو بدينا من البداية خالص من الطلبة بتوعنا وإحنا بنعلمهم في الجامعات، فأعتقد إن دي بيبقى approach قوي وبيفيدهم جدا. وبشكره جدا جدا، أنا استمتعت بالمحاضرة.
أنا متشكر جدا لحضرتك. لو سمحت لي طبعا مستر محمد، أنا متشكر لحضرتك جدا أولا، وطبعا يعني when I meant إن that disabled people should يعني be involved، مش معناها أبدا إن إحنا we wouldn't want non-disabled people to not be involved. إحنا محتاجينكم.
يس
احنا عايزينكم تفكروا معانا، وعايزينكم لانه انكلوجن من الناحيتين. يعني ما ينفعش نقول انكلوجن وكل حاجه بيعملها الديسيبل بيبل بس، ولا ينفع نقول انكلوجن والحاجه بيعملها نون ديسيبل بيبل بس.
يس بالظبط.
وطبعا would be my pleasure ان شاء الله ان احنا to get in touch further يعني بعد.
ان شاء الله يا دكتور، ان شاء الله باذن الله. ثانك يو.
في حد عنده اي سؤال تاني؟ any other question؟
I have one question actually. First of all, I'd like to thank Dr. Mostafa very much for being our guest today. Thank you very much, Dr. Mostafa. You are giving us actually the true perspective of how to design the public places for everyone, inclusive public spaces. My question actually is related to Iman's comments, because I'd like to know from your own experience, what are the biggest failures for the unblind when we are designing for everyone, and we think that we are doing great and making successful designs? What are our biggest failures, and what are the mistakes that we should not do it again, or the consideration maybe that maybe it is not given the importance that it should take?
يعني I will try to answer that in some points. أول حاجة إنه دايما يعني as I discussed, the one criteria for you to understand that you're going in the right direction زي ما قلنا إنك to يعني compose يعني a group of different types of disabilities, group of people who are working in the field أو experts، وناخد رأيهم في الديزاين ده قبل ما نعمل يعني دايما الاكسبيرمنتال فيز يكون فيها ان احنا بناخد اراء الناس قبل اللونشنج كده، يعني قبل ما نفتتح الحاجه او قبل ما نصمم الحاجه، قبل ما نرسم الحاجه. واحنا بنرسم الحاجه نسال الناس الى اي مدى الرسمه دي مناسبه لاحتياجاتهم. فبعتقد انه الفيلير بيحصل لما احنا ما بنسالش الناس السؤال ده. الفيلير كمان بيحصل يعني we will have another failure happening only when we are not following a unified standards وبنعملها on an initiative base. فممكن في الهوتيلز الكبيرة مثلا نلاقيه مهتم جدا بالجزء بتاع الباثرومز، ومهتم جدا بانه يبقى عنده حمام واسع بتاع disabled وهكذا، بس مش مهتم مثلا وكمان في الايربورتس بشوفها دايما في الايربورتس when it comes to بقى رامس ومداخل الاير كرافتس وغيره مش مهتم. فاحنا we are not following a unified standards مع انه احنا عندنا unified standards موجود. اخر فيلير بفكر فيه ان احنا دايما زي ما قلت من شويه انه the urban planners وال people who are working in engineers and people who are giving permissions of constructions does not pay much attention to the universal design اللي قالت عليه دكتوره ايمان او للreasonable accommodation اللي موجود في الكونفنشن. ما حدش بياخده في اعتباره. فاحنا بنعمل المبنى شكله حلو جدا، great design, looks fantastic وممكن يكون كوستي مثلا قوي كمان، بس مش بالضروره المبنى ده متراعي فيه الاكسسبيليتي. يعني اكبر مثلا اصغر مثال I can give it to you the escalators. انا دايما بشوف هنا الاسكليترز when you are on it دايما تلاقي mind the gap وانت داخله الاسكليتر، او الاسكليتر is finishing, nearly finishing, whatever يعني المسج اللي بتتقال. احنا كمان لازم ناخد بالنا من فكره الكاستمايزيشن. مش كل الحمامات بتاعه الفيزيكال اكسسبيليتي بتنفع كل الناس اللي عندهم فيزيكال امبيرمنتس، لانه فيزيكال امبيرمنتس ار ديفرنت. الناس عندها فيزيكال امبيرمنتس مختلفه، وساعات نروح اوتيل نلاقي الحمام متصمم بطريقه بس مش عارفين نقعد الديسيبل جيست زميلنا في حته لان هو عايز الديزاين الثاني، عايز العدله الثانيه للتويليت او للمكان اللي تكون مناسبه لظروف الامبيرمنت بتاعته. there is another level of failure when we are not customizing support and we're not designing things to suit everyone. بنبقى فرحانين ان احنا خدنا one or two model only and we say yeah we are accessible and inclusive. I'm not saying that what's happening is bad, but with my talk عشان I don't want to be يعني understood as negative، بس أحب إنه for further developments towards more accessibility and inclusive places. مش عارف إذا كنت جاوبت على سؤالي.
طيب
شكرا
عندنا
دكتور مصطفى. thank you for your answer.
شكرا دكتور مصطفى. عندنا سؤال من الشيماء فرج مع حفظ الألقاب، بس هي واضح إن عندها مشكلة في المايك، فأنا هقرأ السؤال لحضرتك من الشات. بتقول I have do you agree that considering disabilities in public spaces, starting from including disabled children in schools, that the raising generation should learn about important parts of their community and get involved with them? Have you experienced this issue in your studies before?
Yeah, definitely. This is a very, very interesting question. And thank you very much for raising that question. We're talking here about inclusive education against segregated education. Definitely. يعني world now is moving towards inclusive education, towards mainstreaming children into public schools, which means those public schools also need to be accessible, need to be designed inclusively and publicly to help different participants. It is a culture that we need to inject يعني to teachers, to the school staff. وطبعا مثلا لو if I take in Egypt as an example، عندنا حاجة اسمها هيئة الأبنية التعليمية اللي هي they should take their much attention while they're building schools and buildings and ياخدوا في اعتبارهم الكود اللي أنا بشوفه very positive بتاع مصر ال Accessibility Code of Building of Egypt, which is a nice one that we need just to consider it. So definitely yes, I have experienced this not in my studies, I have experienced this in my life because I was in a segregated school, and it was not a positive experience. Like, I faced lots of difficulty when moving from schools to universities, and definitely all the culture that we learned was segregated culture as well. We're not talking about inclusion. No one knows nothing's about us, and vice versa. So definitely I totally agree with you. ودلوقتي and يعني in many places we have ministerial decrees and legislations talking about inclusive education. We still have resistance, we still have difficulties to accept children within schools, but at least we have the legal framework, we have some funds from international organizations to support the inclusivity of disabled children within schools. So I think that we are starting like the pathway towards an inclusive education.
هل ده إجابة السؤال كده تمام أستاذ شيماء؟ في عندنا we have another I don't know whether it's question from Francesco Sanin.
Yes.
He said, thank you, Dr. Attia, for a wonderful presentation and a call to us all to consider issues that are so important to the construction of just society. It is not only a challenge, but an opportunity to build better cities. I really appreciate the difference you make between impairment and disabilities. We should eliminate disabilities. Thank you. دي كانت ده كان تعليق من
Yeah, thank you very much, and I'm glad. I would be always happy when people who are not working in the field of disability understands that differentiation, because people who are working in the field definitely knows what does disability means and what does impairments means, but we as people as activists working in the fields need also to talk to people who are outsiders or people who are not working in the field of disability, because those are winners. Those the people that will help changing the community. If we only talked to each other but not talking to outsiders, we will not gain anything. So thank you very much.
طيب أنا عندي سؤال بس غلس شويتين. يعني you talked about accessibility for disabled to public spaces. I mean physical accessibility. But what about the economic and social accessibility to, for example, to jobs, to
Yeah, definitely. I mean they are يعني without. So as I said, it is a process. So without having physical accessibility, you will not be able to have a decent employment for disabled people. Because how come you can employ me in a job and this place is not accessible? How come you can employ a blind person in a place and that place doesn't have a computer who is talking to you? How come you can employ me in a place and put my office in the 5th floor and the left door is very close? I have an example from a very famous leader in Egypt, I don't want to mention the name, who went to a cafe nearby the building to interview someone who is disabled because his office is in the 5th floor and the elevator is not accessible. So it is a process. Without physical accessibility, you will not be able to have an economic and social accessibility, because as I spoken like earlier, when you have an accessible tourism, that means you're adding a lot to the economy, because you bring all the money of disabled people who would like to travel, but to come to Egypt, for example, if Egypt is accessible, and then you will definitely be able to open lots of opportunities and jobs for people to work, because now you أنعشت السياحة, you encourage lots of people to work in the field of tourism. And then definitely, when you have places accessible, you would be able to employ lots of disabled people as well in these places. Yani, I know many restaurants who now employ blind chefs who are disabled, like called it's a big chain actually all over the world. It's called Dining in the Dark. And you find it in France, you find it in Britain, you find it everywhere, where like all people who are working in these places are blind. And they will not be able to work in these places unless these places are accessible. Not here speaking about constructions accessibility, but speaking about equipments, assistive tools. Assistive technology is a very, very important theme that didn't manage to mention it during my presentation, but assistive technology now is a big theme that supports disabled people inclusion, work, productivity, and appreciation, like support to their community's economy a lot.
Thank you for.
Thanks.
Do you have any other question from the participants? Okay, we thank you, Dr. Mostafa, for this very interesting presentation and very interesting topic. And definitely would talk a lot about this very important topic and give more examples about what should be done and what's not, and what we have already done, and how can we make improvements to our designs, our decisions about the places we live and we use. So I think this is only a start to this, to tackle this very important topic, and we will not stop here.
Thanks to you, and thanks to everyone who managed to came, and again everyone who invited me to talk today. Would be much appreciated if I can also receive the recording. That would be great of the meeting. And yeah, definitely I'm available to support AMAKEN in any other inclusive and diversified discussion as well. And yeah, towards more an inclusive and accessible public places. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mostafa.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mustafa. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Very much.
And I encourage everybody before we leave that to visit our Dr. Mostafa's YouTube channel. It is in the chat box. So it has very, very interesting videos. So yeah, it's very important if you can visit this. Thank you, Dr. Mustafa, and thank you everybody for attending.
Zoom meeting. Window. Image has keyboard focus.
Thank you everybody for attending this.
No, thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Dr. Mustafa, and see you in our future activities.
Voiceover off.
Thank you. Thank you. Goodbye.
باي باي everyone.
Voiceover on Zoom out.
باي باي.
Zoom meeting.
شكرا لحضرتك جدا
Window.
جدا.
Image has keyboard
السلامة.
focus. Image.
مع السلامة.
You are currently on. Voiceover off.